21. You can write an ebook. For example, it could be about the topic of animals. A final point is you can add chapters and objectives to the product. 2. You should compose a print report. To illustrate, it might be related to automobiles. To close, you might add advertorials and master resell rights to the product. 3. You could make an e-zine. A prime example, it can be referring to babies. A last point is you may add advice and a membership to the product. 4. You might create a how-to article. For instance, it may be touching on birthdays. In ending, you could add analogies/metaphors and loopholes/shortcuts to the product. 5. You can produce a membership site. By way of example, it could be dealing with business. An endpoint is you can add swipe files and outlines to the product. 6. You should manufacture in a class. To illustrate this point, it might be referring making candy/chocolate. To end, you might add analysis and assignments to the product. 7. You could publish in a report. As an example, it can be info about celebrities. And finally, you may add articles and pictures/photos to the product. 8. You might draft a wiki page. To give you an example, it may be connected to crime. In closing, you could add perspectives/history and plans to the product. 9. You can market an online game. Suppose, for instance, it could be relative to child care. And lastly, you can add audio clips and trailers to the product. 10. You should author a biography. As an illustration of this, it might be linked to yourself. To finalize, you might add awards/milestones and presentations to the product deal. 11. You could create a directory. Take, for example, it can be with reference to cleaning. And to end, you may add advertisements and press releases to the product. 12. You might write a book. To further illustrate, it may be themed about climates. In conclusion, you could add brandable rights and previews to the product. 13. You can broadcast a newsletter. To present an example, it could be on the subject of communities. And to conclude, you can add blog posts and reader email to the product. 14. You should formulate a lesson. For illustrative purposes, it might be in respect to computers/internets. To conclude, you might add blueprints and private label rights to it. 15. You could throw together a column. A classic example, it can be regarding communications. A final statement is you may add opinions and procedures to the product. 16. You might exhibit a forum. To elaborate on this, it may be content about conspiracy theories. In summary, you could add bios, posts, and sections to the product. 17. You can develop music. A case that illustrates this, it could be pertaining to instrumentals. A last statement is you can graphic covers and lyrics to the product. 18. You should construct a webcam. To cite an instance, it might be about the niche cooking/food. To close, you might add case studies and processes to the product. 19. You could publicize a movie. A known example, it can be about crime. An end statement is you may add special features and transcripts to the product. 20. You might upload a MP3. To point to an instance, it may be related to children/kids. In sum, you could add tracks and playlists to the product. 21. You can circulate a magazine. For example, it could about the topic of crafts. As a final point is you can add checklists and pros/cons to the product. 22. You should tape an audiobook. To illustrate, it might be referring to credit card. To finish up, you might add classes and challenges to the product. 23. You could reveal a list. A prime example, it can be touching on countries/states. As a last point is you may add profiles and Q&As to the product. 24. You might invest in a mobile site. For instance, it may be dealing with dating/singles. To recap, you could add singles ads and questionnaires to the product. 25. you can set up a links page. By way of example, it could be referring decorating. As an endpoint is you can add product reviews and product recalls to the product. 26. You should design a search engine. To illustrate this point, it might be one about dental/vision. Lastly, you might add descriptions and advertisements to the product. 27. You could organize a script. This is an example. It can be connected to investing. To some, you may add rates and commentary to the product. At 28, you might retail a tutorial. To give you an example, it may be relative to education/college. Finally, you could add concepts and questions to the product. 29. You can air a TV show. Suppose, for instance, it could be linked to science. In the end, you can add consulting and viewer advice to the product. 30. You should compile a survey/poll. As an illustration of this, it might be with reference to energy. To highlight, you might add results and ratings/rankings to the product. 31. You could syndicate an autoresponder series. Take, for example, it can be themed about entertainment. To recall, you may add countdowns and coaching to the product. 32. You might auction off a CD. To further illustrate, it may be on the subject of the environment. To summarize, you could add protest petitions and recommendations to the product. 33. You can release an app. To present an example, it could be in respect to exotic/adult niches. To wrap up, you can add transcripts and recordings to the product. 34. You should advertise a cartoon. For illustrative purposes, it might be regarding fashion. In summarization, you might add comic strips and drawings to the product. 35. You could transmit a news commentary. A classic example, it can be content about construction. To outline, you may add reader advice and related resources to the product. 36. You might pitch a DVD. To elaborate on this, it may be pertaining to fiction. Last but not least, you could add stories and alternative endings to the product. 37. You can script a virtual world. A case that illustrates this, it could be about the niche family. Also remember, you can add day in history and reminders to the product. 38. You should prepare a graph/pie chart. To cite an instance, it might be on the idea of electronics/technology. My conclusion is you might references and reports to the product. 39. You could vend online audio. A known example, it can be about the topic of saving money. To sum up, you may add coupons and new trends to the product. 40. You might issue a video clip. To point to an instance, it may be related to gambling/lottery. In final analysis, you could add definitions and resell rights to the product. 41. You can form a scrapbook/photo gallery. For example, it could be referring to games. Last of all, you can add demonstrations and reviews to the product. 42. You should announce a podcast. To illustrate, it might be touching on gardening. One final issue is you might add descriptions and recipes to the product. 43. You could display a files/folders share. A prime example, it can be dealing with gifts. My last point is you may add terms and rules to the product. 44. You might create a chat room. For instance, it may be referring diet/nutrition. One can conclude you could add directions and health samples to the product. 45. You can forge an autobiography. By way of example, it could be info about you. A final point is you can add personal and professional credentials to the product. 46. You should start an infomercial. To illustrate this point, it might be connected to hobbies. To close, you might add comparisons and contrasting to the product. 47. You could distribute a review. This is an example. It can be relative to holidays. A last point is you may add critiquing and decorations to the product. 48. You might make a message board. To give you an example, it may be linked to home remedies. In ending, you could add schemes and screenshots to the product. 49. You can launch a recording. Suppose, for instance, it could be with reference to humor. A endpoint is you can add event listings and jokes to the product. 50. You should wholesale a teleseminar. As an illustration of this, it might be themed about music/instruments. To end, you might add examples and shortcuts to the product. 51. You could establish a blog. Take, for example, it can be on the subject of inventions. And finally, you may add excerpts and columns to the product. 52. You might expose screenshots. To further illustrate, it may be in respect to the government. In closing, you could add debates and slideshows to the product. 53. You can unveil a seminar. To present an example, it could be regarding jewelry. And lastly, you can add explanations and software to the product. 54. You should compose an events calendar. For illustrative purposes, it might be content about language. To finalize, you might add schedules and locations to the product. 55. You could release an interview. A classic example, it can be pertaining to landscaping. And to end, you may add facts and sources to the product. 56. You might air a play-by-play broadcast. To elaborate on this, it may be about the niche of sports. In conclusion, you could add scores and statistics to the product. 57. You can create a transcription. A case that illustrates this, it could be on the idea of makeup. And to conclude, you can add favorite websites and steps to the product. 58. You should draft a FAQ page. To cite an instance, it might be about the topic of manufacturing. To conclude, you might add features and to the product. 59. You could formulate a workshop. A known example, it can be related to affiliate programs. A final statement is you may add formulas and strategies to the product. 60. You might author a quiz. To point to an instance, it may be referring to men/woman. In summary, you could add profiles and studies to the product. 61. You can sell a teleclass. For example, it could be touching on real estate. A last statement is you can add quotes and success stories to the product. 62. You should make a presentation. To illustrate, it might be dealing with marriage/weddings. To close, you might add stories and suggestions to the product. 63. You could sketch a drawing. A prime example, it can be referring religion. A end statement is you may add scriptures and sayings to the product. 64. You might invent a slideshow. For instance, it may be info about movies. In some, you could add rants/raves and survey/results to the product. 65. You can produce a training class. By way of example, it could be connected to nature. As a final point is you can add factors and solutions to the product. 66. You should manufacture a fan page. To illustrate this point, it might be relative to exercise/fitness. To finish up, you might add guest articles and exercises to the product. 67. You could publish an online video. This is an example. It can be linked to nightlife. As a last point, you may add guides and RSS feeds to the product. 68. You might invest in a software. To give you an example, it may be with reference to productivity. To recap, you could add graph/pie charts and systems to the product. 69. You can market an advertorial. Suppose, for instance, it could be themed about products. As an endpoint, you can add highlights and summaries to the product. 70. You should develop a social site. As an illustration of this, it might be on the subject of outdoors. Lastly, you might add history lessons and techniques to the product. 71. You could upload a website. Take, for example, it can be in respect to parenting. To some, you may add dad/mom advice and experiment to the product. 72. You might broadcast a streaming audio. To further illustrate, it may be regarding paranormal. Finally, you could add ideas and term definitions to the product. 73. You can exhibit a glossary. To present an example, it could be content about pregnancy. In the end, you can add facts and instructions to the product. 74. You should tape a streaming video. For illustrative purposes, it might be pertaining to neighborhoods. To highlight, you might add maps and to-do lists to the product. 75. You could throw together a Q&A. A classic example, it can be about the niche of pets. To recall, you may add syndicate content and tactics to the product. 76. You might design a micro-blog. To elaborate on this, it may be on the idea of politics. To summarize, you could add interviews and tips to the product. 77. You can construct a video parodies. A case that illustrates this, it could be about the topic of radio/television. To wrap up, you can add transcripts and news to the product. 78. You should syndicate a top article. To cite an instance, it might be related to relationships. In summarization, you might add horoscopes and theories to the product. 79. You could release a favorite links/bookmarks. A known example, it can be referring to safety/secure. To outline, you may add interpretations and trade/swap linking offers to the product. 80. You might circulate a video tour. To point to an instance, it may be touching on marketing/advertising. Last but not least, you could add JV offers and training to the product. Current fad 81. You can organize a texting transcripts. For example, it could be dealing with singles. My conclusion is you can add abbreviation and lingo meanings to the product. 82. You should reveal a profile/about me page. To illustrate, it might be referring self-help. To sum up, you might add lessons and motivational quotes to the product. 83. You could publicize an online tools. A prime example, it can be info about shopping. In final analysis, you may add gift certificates and freebies to the product. 84. You might whip up a statistics stats page. For instance, it may be connected to seniors. Last of all, you could add templates and trivia questions to the product. 85. You can distribute advice/feedback. By way of example, it could be relative to sexuality. One final issue is you can add links and remedies/therapies to the product. 86. You should compile trivia questions. To illustrate this point, it might be linked to social networking. My last point is you might add lists and truth or false question to the product. 87. You could transmit a myth article. This is an example. It can be with reference to society/culture. One can conclude you may add internals news and tutorials to the product. 88. You might start an archives. To give you an example, it may be themed about software. A final point is you could add old downloads and tools to the product. 89. You can air a countdown video. Suppose, for instance, it could be on the subject of career/jobs. To close, you can add maps and job/wanted listings to the product. 90. You should display syndicated content. As an illustration of this, it might be in respect to space. A last point is you might add timelines and tests to the product. 91. You could advertise a press release. Take, for example, it can be regarding tattoos. In ending, you may add tricks and video clips to the product. 92. You might offer a coaching/consulting. To further illustrate, it may be content about taxes. A endpoint is you could add methods and laws to the product. 93. You can prepare assignments. To present an example, it could be pertaining to lifestyle. To end, you can add misconceptions and visuals to the product. 94. You should set up a RSS feed. For illustrative purposes, it might be if the niche about teens. A final point is you can add goals and a Dear John column to the product. 95. You could sell an event recordings. A classic example, It can be on the idea of insurance/legal. To close, you might add mistakes/blunders and warnings to the product. 96. You might retail an online service. To elaborate on this, it may be about the topic of video games. A last point is you may add freebies and game reviews to the product. 97. You can unveil forum reposts. A case that illustrates this. It could be related to travel/vacation. In ending, you could add and webinars to the product. 98. You should form a mastermind/brainstorm session. To cite an instance, it might be referring to war/military. A endpoint is you can add myths and wishes/prayers to the product. 99. You could broadcast a reality video. A known example, it can be touching on weather. To end, you might add news stories and witnessed events to the product. 100. You might expose a conversation transcript. To point to an instance, it may be dealing with self-defense/weapons. And finally, you may add info reports and training sessions to the product.